This is BBC News. I'm Duncan Golostani. Our top stories. Expect it to be like Italy. The Trump administration issues a stark warning about the spread of coronavirus.
Together we have the power to save countless lives. We're attacking the virus on every front with social distancing, economic support.
A grim milestone in the UK. The daily death toll passes 500 for the first time. Italy extends its stringent lockdown measures, but families are now allowed to take their children for a walk. And the painter David Hockney, in lockdown in France, shares with us some of the drawings that have been keeping him busy. Hello, welcome to BBC News. The US Vice President has warned Americans to expect a coronavirus scenario comparable to Italy. There have now been more than 200,000 confirmed infections in the United States and more than 4,500 deaths. In New York alone, nearly 400 people died in the past 24 hours. People in Florida and Texas are now being told to stay at home. All this after President Trump warned of a rough few weeks ahead. Our North America editor John Sopel reports.
At this time of year, Central Park in New York would normally be getting ready for concerts and festivals. Instead, a massive field hospital is being built there to help alleviate an overburdened health system. In this state alone, there have been 2,000 deaths. America is shifting onto a war footing, and it's brought a dramatic change in tone from the president, now urgent and sombre.
I want every American to be prepared for the hard days that lie ahead. We're going to go through a very tough 2 weeks. And then hopefully, as the experts are predicting, as I think a lot of us are predicting after having studied it so hard, you're going to start seeing some real light at the end of the tunnel. But this is going to be a very painful, very painful 2 weeks.
And if that didn't frighten the American people, this message today from the Vice President visiting essential workers surely would have done. He said that the US was on a path to follow the worst-hit country in Europe.
We think Italy may be the most comparable area to the United States at this point.
For the first time in this crisis, Donald Trump and his senior medical advisors seem to be marching in lockstep. But one area where Washington seems at odds with the rest of the country is on testing, on vital equipment. Here, the president says that everything is under control. That's not what you're hearing on the front line. Today, exhausted health workers across the US have been protesting outside hospitals at the lack of protective equipment. And those working inside say supplies are running low.
We're running out of medications, we're running out of equipment, and we're even running out of oxygen, which is something that patients that have COVID-19 need.
And we're running out of equipment in the hospital. Nearly everybody coming to the emergency department has this, and we're getting completely overwhelmed.
If New York is the foretaste of what's coming to America, this is what's ahead. In the money capital of the richest country in the world, a forklift truck outside a hospital lifting corpses into the back of a refrigerated lorry. John Sopel, BBC News, Washington.
Well, in his latest press conference a few hours ago, President Trump says the country has a decent amount of ventilators, with more on their way into the country.
We're shipping things right in. We have, as you know, almost 10,000 ventilators, which we need for flexibility. It's a lot. It sounds like a lot, but it's not, because as you see on the board from yesterday, as this scourge, as this plague, as this virus moves, it moves very fast. And we don't know yet whether we're going to need it in Louisiana, in New York, you know, wherever it may be. So we're ready for it. We're totally ready for it. We're going to be shipping out. We've already agreed to ship out over 1,000 today to different sites, different locations. But we have to have the flexibility of moving the ventilators to where the virus is going. And we'll be able to see that, we'll be able to see that from charts a couple of days in advance. So right now we have a nice pile of ventilators. We have a lot more coming in. We have I think we have 11 companies making ventilators right now.
Our North America correspondent Peter Bowes was watching that press conference and joins us now from Los Angeles. Peter, what were the main messages in that press conference?
Well, with every new day, every new White House briefing, the president's language, the tone becomes ever more ominous. He described the next 2 weeks as potentially being horrific in terms of the number of cases, the number of deaths in the United States likely to peak during that time. And this echoed, of course, what he was saying 24 hours ago when he said the next few weeks would be painful. And we have the projection that Mike Pence, the vice president, was talking about, that the United States is on the same trajectory as Italy, of course, where there have been more deaths than anywhere else in the world, which is really very difficult for Americans to hear as they are struggling day to day just to deal with the situation that they are faced with. Social isolation is causing a lot of hardship, and at the same time we are getting some officials here on the West Coast in Los Angeles saying that some people are still not taking social isolation seriously enough. They're very concerned about the spread of this virus by people who are infected but are otherwise healthy. In other words, they're not showing any symptoms, and they're still trying to get the message out that no matter how you feel physically at the moment, you need to stay at home.
Peter Bowes in Los Angeles, thank you very much. And just to say, a little later in the programme, we'll be talking about the impact the coronavirus outbreak is having on American politics. That's coming up shortly. But first, here in the UK, there has been another significant rise in the number of people dying with coronavirus. The government has described it as an invisible killer and the biggest threat the country has faced in decades. 563 patients have died in hospitals in the UK in the past 24 hours, bringing the national total to more than 2,300. Most of the cases are in London, but the health authorities say the threat is everywhere. Here's our political editor, Laura Kunsberg.
Hilda Churchill, who lived through a pandemic a century ago, the oldest victim at 108. Dr. Ardil El-Tuyar, the first medic to pass away. Doreen Hunt, a grandmother who died on Mothering Sunday. As coronavirus has taken hold, just some of the faces of its early victims. But as the numbers grow, more families lose mothers, daughters, fathers and sons. And one of the latest, the fourth medic to lose his life, Dr. Alpha Sadhu, who'd returned to work to help. This is his son.
So we said our goodbyes and we just told him to fight for us. And then the next 24 hours, 40 hours, his body just deteriorated. From what they told us, his body shut down, he had organ failure, and he just couldn't fight anymore. I massively admire the people at the NHS and the job that they're doing, because it's no joke. This is a serious virus and people are risking their lives to save people out there.
A message repeated by the government today.
All our thoughts and prayers are with the families and loved ones of those who have lost their lives. This is more tragic evidence that this virus does not discriminate.
Look at how the numbers have grown from the first counted on the 6th of March. 8 days later, the daily toll reached double figures. 20 days from the beginning, that figure reached over 100. Now, less than a week later, more than 500 people recorded to have passed away in 24 hours. The overall count, 2,352.
The peak of this disease seems to be coming earlier than the government expected, but you are missing the testing targets. There's a huge amount of evidence of staff not having the equipment they desperately need. There are not enough ventilators. Do you accept now that the approach and the response from government has just been too slow?
Increasing testing capacity is absolutely the government's top priority. We're now at 10,000 tests a day. We're rolling out additional networks of labs and testing sites. And in terms of PHE, over the last 2 weeks, 390 million products have been distributed. And of course, we will continue to do more.
There's evidence too that people are taking to the roads again, flouting the stay-at-home advice. There are frantic efforts underway to make space for those falling ill. The army moving in to help in Cumbria tonight. In Belfast, in Glasgow, in Cardiff and around the country, hospitals being created out of conference centres in just a matter of weeks. But the broad political consensus that's backed the government's approach is starting to fray.
So what we're really calling for now is a national testing strategy a strategy to ramp up the community testing and contact tracing, like we're seeing in other countries. That's how other countries have been able to beat this virus or get this virus under control and suppressed. We're not doing it yet, so we need that national plan.
A former minister and practicing GP says the government just hasn't moved fast enough.
We'd anticipated this as a risk. It's a tier 1 national security risk. That's in the public domain. It does beg a belief that we didn't actually sort of act quicker because we knew, because we'd done an exercise, we knew that we had these challenges.
But no ordinary recovering patient, Prince Charles urges us all to stick together.
As a nation, we are faced by a profoundly challenging situation, which we are only too aware threatens the livelihoods, businesses and welfare of millions of our fellow citizens. None of us can say when this will end, but end it will.
But a time of anxiety for our health and the country's wealth is a growing time of political pressure too. Laura Kunsberg, BBC News.
As the coronavirus continues to spread, concern is growing for the millions of people around the world currently living in refugee camps and migrant detention centres. Aid workers in places such as Syria, Bangladesh and Greece say that the often cramped and unsanitary conditions could lead to a humanitarian disaster should the virus find its way in. Well, for more on this, let's speak to Dr. Barry Fatterford from the Sydney-based organisation Doctors for Refugees. Hello, Dr. Fatterford. We're spending so much of our time talking about the effects that the coronavirus is having on our densely populated cities. What would happen when it finds its way into a refugee camp?
Well, in the refugee camp, once it actually gets a foothold, it's going to be a disaster. We know that we've got 65 million people currently displaced around the world, and one of our biggest refugee camps in Bangladesh has almost 1 million people. Now, with overcrowding, poor sanitation and very little access to essential healthcare services, in a population that is already very vulnerable from a health point of view, diseases flourish in the detention centres. We've seen things like diphtheria, cholera, malaria. It's pretty much a perfect storm for having this virus get completely out of control.
If those basic measures that we take for granted, washing your hands, keeping your distance and access to healthcare, are obviously not present in refugee camps, what can be done then to mitigate it?
The first thing we need to do is for governments around the world, the host countries' governments, to take a very proactive approach, because waiting until we actually see an epidemic going through these camps is going to be way too late. We've seen how quickly it's progressed in the UK and in other parts of Europe. We can't let that take hold in the camps. So we need to, first of all, have a look and see what sort of emergency measures we can put in place when the disease runs through the various camps, the various refugee centres that are dotted on the southern border of European countries. Now, we can make use of facilities, like a lot of places have schools closed, so at least we know that we can potentially use those places as isolation facilities. Hand washing and basic sanitation, delivery of soap, hand sanitisers to these centres and to these camps are going to be the mainstay. Some things like social distancing is clearly impossible in detention camps and in refugee camps, as are things like testing. Now, testing is really important in countries in Europe, North America and Australia. Testing, at least at this stage, is of limited practicality. People are moving around a lot. There are 65 million displaced people, the overwhelming majority who don't want to be displaced. And so while many of them are going to be there for several years, an awful lot of them are going to be on the move. Many don't have identity papers, and all these things are quite inherent to testing. So rather than adopt the same measures that we're adopting in the developed world, we're going to have to adapt it. So aid workers need to have personal PPE, personal protective equipment. Things like that need to be ramped up very, very quickly. and credible emergency procedures need to be instilled. So if there is an outbreak, say at the southern border near Greece, we know that there are going to be facilities where we can isolate people. And that needs to be
Dr.
done.
Fatterford, I'm so sorry to interrupt you, but we're up against the clock. But thank you very much for joining us, and we do appreciate your analysis. Thank you.
Thank you.
Stay with us here on BBC News. Still to come, Italy extends its lockdown, but there are the first signs that the outbreak may be stabilising.
The accident that happened here was of the sort that can at worst produce a meltdown. In this case, the precautions worked, but they didn't work quite well enough to prevent some old fears about the safety features of these stations from resurfacing.
The Republic of Ireland has become the first country in the world to ban smoking in the workplace. From today, anyone lighting up in offices, businesses, pubs and restaurants will face a heavy fine.
The president was on his way out of the Washington Hilton Hotel where he had been addressing a trade union conference. The small crowd outside included his assailant.
It has become a symbol of Paris. 100 years ago, many Parisians wished it had never been built. The Eiffel Tower's birthday is being marked by a reenactment of the first ascent by Gustave Eiffel.
Welcome back. You're watching BBC News. A reminder of our top story this hour. The Trump administration issued a stark warning about the spread of coronavirus, saying it could get as bad as Italy. Let's stay with the US, where more than 200,000 people across the country have been infected by the coronavirus, and the outbreak is costing millions of people their jobs and has devastated the stock market. Despite that, President Trump's approval ratings have jumped in the most recent polls. So let's just focus in on that for a moment and talk to Alan Lichtman. He is a presidential historian and professor at American University and joins us now. Alan, how much should we be reading into this, the fact that there has been a bump in the polls for President Trump in the last week or so?
Read very little into it. There's always kind of a rally around the president effect early on in a crisis. And Donald Trump's bump has been vastly lower than is typical in these kinds of situations. George W. Bush jumped 30 points after 9/11. Donald Trump has jumped about 4 points. And in matchups against the nearly invisible presumptive Democratic nominee Joe Biden, he's trailing Biden in the latest polls somewhere between 2 and 10 percentage points. And people's confidence in his leadership is already beginning to erode and is far lower than that of their confidence in their governors.
I was ever so surprised to see, you expect Republicans to rally around President Trump, but I was surprised to see that there has been a small shift among independent voters and Democrats. Could you not see there be voters taking a fresh look at President Trump as he's under pressure?
Well, I think certainly that's always true in a crisis. And let's not forget, Trump has had the national stage to himself. They hold a press conference every day, and Trump uses that press conference in lieu of a campaign rally to promote himself and promote his reelection. That's going to have some effect across the board. But we are a long way from seeing the end of this crisis and a long way from seeing the presidential election. There is a tendency to read far too much in early polls. And let me tell you, as an election expert, early polls have zero predictive value when it comes to a presidential election or where a president stands on the eve of election. Let's not forget, after the 1991 Gulf War, George H.W. Bush's approval rating shot up to about 90%, and he still lost in 1992.
So what do you think this crisis is revealing about President Trump, his strengths and his weaknesses, actually not perceived by us, but perceived by regular voters in the States?
Yes, I think it's showing exactly who Trump is. it shows his great strength, which is as a showman. He is absolutely exploiting these coronavirus briefings in a brilliant way. And it shows his ability to dodge and deflect. You know, once the Republican Party was the party of personal responsibility, but Trump has taken responsibility for nothing. He's blamed the lack of a strong response on everything ranging from Barack Obama to the Democrats, to the Chinese, to the CDC. And that, of course, shows his weakness, his inability to assume accountability for anything, and his continuing pervasive lying. He has purveyed more misinformation to the American people during this crisis than any other president in the history of this country faced with any kind of crisis.
OK, Alan Lichtman, it's going to be a fascinating year, isn't it? Thank you very much for speaking to us. Italy's stringent lockdown measures have been extended, although families are now allowed to take their children for a walk outside if needed. It comes as the death toll in the country climbs by 727 in the past 24 hours. That's slightly down on Tuesday's increase. From Rome, Mark Lowen reports.
A glimpse of freedom in Italy's new normal. Parents are now allowed to take their children out for a brief walk if urgent. After 3 weeks of lockdown, it's a breath of liberty, but no more. Welcomed, albeit with apprehension.
We're scared to be outside and a bit spaced out because this lockdown has been our salvation. The measures are working. I'm happy they're in place and we want them to go on.
This eases the tension. We're not used to staying inside the whole day. We need some natural light and children need some space.
The infection rate is slowing and there is perhaps a little bit more movement on the streets. But the fear is that if the restrictions are lifted too soon, people could get a false sense of security and then the numbers could start jumping again. Because Italy is still far from defeating this virus. Deaths are still soaring, and among them, doctors.
Gynecologist Roberto Miletti died this week, one of 67 doctors lost to the outbreak here. His friend says the deaths were preventable if medics had proper masks and supplies.
We're very shocked. He was much loved. And we're very angry because we're lacking protection equipment for doctors. We feel vulnerable. Wars must be organized during peacetime, not battle. We've been sent in empty-handed in Italy and around Europe.
So young, inventive Italians have stepped in to help, using 3D printing to develop a valve that turns a sports shop snorkeling mask into a ventilator. The blueprint has been downloaded for free 1 million times by hospitals in need across the world.
2 days ago, it was my birthday, and I received a message from Brazil in which a doctor says me that 100 people were breathing thanks to my idea, and I was very, very happy. I cannot receive a better present for my birthday.
Italians are generally following the rules, but some frustration is starting to show. In the south, anger over a loss of money and closed shops. It's isolated, but patience has its limits. Today, the lockdown was extended to mid-April, so the emptiness goes on. Perhaps never again in our lifetime will we see Rome like this. The virus is sucking the life out of Italy. Mark Lowen, BBC News, Rome.
David Hockney is one of the most influential British artists still alive today. He's been creating art on his iPad for over 10 years and is currently in lockdown at home in France. Our arts editor Will Gompertz has this.
Dear Will, in 2018, JP, my assistant, and I came to Normandy after the window was put up in Westminster Abbey. We loved it here, and I suggested to JP this would be a great place to draw and paint the arrival of spring. There are apple, pear, cherry and plum blossom, with hawthorn and blackthorn. East Yorkshire only had blackthorn and hawthorn. We found this house with a large garden that was cheaper than anything in Sussex. We bought it. I began straight away drawing on a Japanese fold-out book. I drew all around the house and then I drew the house itself. These were exhibited in New York in September 2019. Being a smoker, I do not care for New York, so I never went. We came back here to Normandy on March the 2nd, and I began drawing the winter trees on my new iPad. I'm here with Jonathan and JP, my assistants. Then the virus started. We are locked in here, but I don't mind. It's Jonathan, now cut off from his family in Harrogate, and JP who feel it more. I went on drawing the winter trees that eventually burst into blossom. This is the stage we're at right now. Meanwhile, the virus is going mad, and many people said my drawings were a great respite from what was going on. Why are my iPad drawings seen as a respite from the news? Well, they're obviously made by the hand, depicting the renewal that is the spring. I intend to carry on with my work, which I now see as very important. We have lost touch with nature rather foolishly, as we are part of it, not outside it. This will, in time, be over, and then what? What have we learned? I'm 83 years old, I will die. The cause of death is birth. The only real things in life are food and love, in that order.
You're watching BBC News.